Hi, welcome to Free Advice. This is our third edition of our study skills series, that's hard to say, and we are with Gayle St. John. She is a teacher at Norman High School. As a matter of fact, she is Norman High's Teacher of the Year this year, and she has been at Norman High teaching senior English for the last 9 years. This is her ninth year, and we're so pleased to have you.
Thank you.
Our topic for today is taking notes that work for you. I know a lot of students get into classes and they somehow don't take notes. I know when students come into my office and are having trouble with classes, and I ask them, well, do you keep a notebook? Do you keep track of the assignments? Do you keep notes from lectures? Oftentimes what they show me is a lot of empty pieces of paper. And so we're hoping that you'll give us a guideline for how to take notes that students can actually use.
Well, I think what you've identified to begin with directs us to what I wanted to first talk about, which is simply why take notes. Because I would have to say that across the board, students probably don't take enough notes. And I think sometimes the mistake is made. They think that they only need to take notes when a lecture, per se, is going on. And even in a discussion, I do teach English, and so lots of times we're having simply discussions about literature. And I always encourage students to take notes even when we're doing that. Lots of times they'll do that in the text that we're studying, but they should be actively involved. I think you just have done a session on active reading, and it's almost like taking notes is a kind of active listening because it keeps you involved and helps you to synthesize. And that would be, if we're looking at why take notes, the first reason might be simply to clarify and organize material. Hopefully, if you're in a lecture situation, it's organized to begin with. But that's not always true, and it may not be an organization that you immediately grasp. So it's important to simply jot some things down as you're going through to keep track of the information. Also, a lot of the information, of course, is probably new, and you cannot simply remember it all based upon a first hearing, so you would need to write it down. Another reason to take notes is to kind of summarize what's gone on, and it simply helps you to pull things together. It's almost kind of a synthesizing of the information on the part of the student. I think that's helpful. Another reason, I guess the third reason I would say for why to take notes is for reinforcement. I think it's a reinforcement as a student simply in the act of writing. I mean, physically, lots of students, I know that I myself think of myself more as a visual learner. I can't remember names unless I see them written down. And lots of students really find it more effective to see something written down. There may be things written on the board, but there are things that are going to be said that the student also needs, and the act of physically writing it down helps the student to remember. In addition to that, a kind of reinforcement is something we'll talk about at the end today, I hope, a kind of reinforcement in that you go back over your notes as a study tool at the same time.
Well, and I think for me personally, it's very important that I have just the action of being involved with the lecture or with what's going on in class.
I think that's true.
That's probably the most important facet from my personal perspective.
It keeps your mind engaged while you're concentrating on trying to take things down so that you don't think about what you're going to do this weekend or what you did last week and have your mind drift off. That's true.
Okay, now that we know why it's important to take notes, how do we go about this? What's a strategy, or what are some of the ways we can do this?
Okay. Well, if you were taking notes over what we're talking about here, the first thing I'd like to talk about simply are some kind of general tips. You mentioned the notebook, that students are supposed to usually be keeping a notebook, and you look through that and it tends to be blank. That first topic of notebook is a decision you have to make. And this sounds very, very basic, but you have to choose whether you use a spiral or a loose leaf notebook. There are advantages to both, to either one, but I would recommend a loose leaf notebook because it allows you to switch things around. It allows you to take pages out and spread them in front of you. You may have a lecture that is sequenced and you need really to kind of see that all at once in order to make full sense of it, and when you're studying you can do that. One practical thing, I know that we used to do this a lot in college, and I see students do it even here in high school, as certainly they should, but that's to share your notes. Someone's absent, and so you can hand them just a day or two's worth of notes instead of having to run the risk of letting go of your entire notebook, which has a semester's worth of notes in it, which is very valuable. Another really little thing is just to date each entry, keep track on a daily basis of what's going on. That's easier if you have questions. If you missed something, it's easier to fit that in. Or if you have questions about something that was in the notes on a specific day, it's often easier for the instructor to have it keyed by a date. The other thing is ink color. I know this sounds very petty, but I know there have been studies done about what colors we best respond to and what colors intellectually stimulate us. And they always tell us to take notes in red. I rarely did that, but supposedly you remember things written in red. One thing you might do is alternate ink colors, and that simply, especially when you're studying, helps to make things stand out or gives a little variety rather than just all blending together.
One of the things that I found when I was taking notes back not too long ago when I was in college, that if I went back through and highlighted, even with a yellow highlighter, that tended to make things stand out also. So that's another.
Yes, I think that is another good idea, and most of my college notes have highlights in them too as I went back and studied. Or a different color ink, again. But yeah, a way to go back, and it's almost like the kind of active reading that you talked about now in your notes, because in the note-taking, certainly you are going to take some things down that probably weren't as important, or that aren't as important when you finally get down to an exam, if you will, as when they were said in class as you thought. So you have to go back and kind of edit out.
Now, there are several different outline or note-taking forms. What are some of those?
Well, I think that probably the one that a student would be using most here in high school would be what we might call a modified outline, where you would simply, and you're taking notes here on main ideas and major details. It really, I think this fits in very nicely to your active reading ideas because you're keying in on main topics and main ideas. And the idea of active reading, of course, that you're marking things as you go along. And you're doing the same thing when you take notes. It's just that you're doing it from someone talking. So you're looking for key ideas. And what you want to do is set up a kind of hierarchy. And most of the time, I think, for notes that you're taking for yourself, the formal outlining process that we do teach in school is probably not worth messing with. But you're taking notes for yourself, so you'd simply set up in some fashion, whether you set up a heading that has it capitalized or underlined or circled, but you put some sort of main heading and then just kind of categorize underneath that, and probably numbering the items underneath. Lots of my notes simply use a dash on items that follow if I wasn't numbering, because lots of times a lecturer isn't going to do it in a formal outline process, but simply sets up some kind of hierarchy, and that's what you're after, to keep things grouped in your notes, categorized. If we could see on the screen right now a modified outline about the left brain and right brain, and you'll see there that broad category, left brain and right brain, and simply a list then under each one. And we'll use that same topic in just a minute to talk about a different type. But you just see a list of terms there underneath each category, and that can help you remember. It's conceivable, of course, if you had trouble with one of these terms, you probably would have written some more notes on one of those items. Another type that I just mentioned already would be the formal outline. You probably won't use that as you're taking notes from a lecture. You would probably use that one in working on a research paper. Most likely here at Norman High it would be in the senior year or in a history class, where you would be doing some sort of research paper and you're taking notes from a text. And then you might put things together in an outline fashion, or when you're preparing to do a paper. But most of the time it's not the kind of thing you'd bother with in a quick note-taking situation. The third one then would be what we might refer to as a free-form outline, which is more of a visual representation of the idea itself. And you'd see that, if we were to see on the screen again in reference to the right brain, left brain, you see in the middle that the brain has two hemispheres. And that puts there visually for you the brain in the center and then left and right on opposite sides. And you see branching out from there, this time visually as kind of a diagram, all of those categories. But it's the same idea. The diagram you come up with has something to do with the idea itself. And lots of times a lecturer will do something. This sometimes happens in a lecture where it's a combination lecture discussion and something's generated and it'll be drawn then on the board, and you can simply adapt that in your notes. A fourth item might be writing summaries, whether from the reading or lecture. And again, this would be hard to do in an actual lecture situation, but it might be a good idea to go back, particularly if the material was new or very difficult for you, to go back and write a summary on your own after class. That's really a test of whether you understand the material. And it's good to do that certainly before you get to the test, to the exam, so that you can get help if there's something you had difficulty with.
Well, and even within the note-taking process, a student could listen carefully and then summarize at least a small idea, rather in putting it in their own words instead of trying to copy down every word. So
Right, I'm glad you mentioned that, because oftentimes when a teacher is lecturing, the teacher may be using vocabulary that is not really the student's own, even if the student understands that vocabulary. And so it is a better idea to take the notes in your own words to simply summarize concepts. Certainly there are key terms that you're going to need from the lecture. But if it's not a language specific to the topic, then yes, that's a very good point, to summarize it in your words, because then it belongs to you a lot more. It's easier to remember.
Okay, and it would also be important to employ a kind of personal shorthand to make the notes more valuable to the individual.
Yes, I think, and you help me out here, I think here at Norman High School we have a note-taking class or a note hand. It's called note hand. Okay, and I've seen a bit of that from one of the note hand, I guess Ms. Gallagher, I think the note hand teacher. And it would take a little practice to get used to using it. But certainly I think that's very effective. I know that, I don't know if people still use shorthand at all in certain situations, but I think that would be effective. I think that even if you don't take a note hand class, that you can be conscious of developing your own shorthand in taking notes. It's a speed kind of situation, and you need to be getting things down quickly, not just so that you get everything, but so that you have some time while you're taking notes to think about what's happening in the class. I find that one of the biggest problems that students have is concentrating intellectually on what's being said because they're so furiously trying to get it all down. So anything that can help make it quicker for you to get it down, I think, is helpful. If we could see on the screen here a sample of developing a personal shorthand, you'll see some examples there and some suggestions for what to consider. For example, use only one abbreviation for each word. Make up your mind and decide what it means so that you're not confused when you go back in your notes. And you'll see some other options there. Capital letters, simply to stand for something. Using only a couple of letters. Chapter, probably that's one most students would do now, simply putting a CH, or for example, the EX. Using only the first and last letters of a word. There's some words we seem to automatically abbreviate that way. Slashes, letters, and symbols for certain words. Or standard symbols to stand for certain words, like the number sign or equals. I would also strongly suggest, though, that students come up with, based upon a particular class, some shorthand of their own. I know that in every note I've ever taken in regard to Shakespeare, there's an SH in my notes, and that's Shakespeare. And even now, as I'm making notes for teaching a new novel, for example, in my advanced placement classes right now, we're studying Invisible Man. I've never taught that novel before, so I've been taking lots of notes. And you get tired of writing out Invisible Man, so it's IM. And that's an easy abbreviation. I think it's important to do that with names that are long. I mean, there's no point in writing them out all of the time. It's important to do, perhaps even in a science class, with special terminology to create your own shorthand for special jargon or terms that are specific to a discipline.
Okay, so that should really at least make it more quick for students to get things written down. Now, one of the things that I noticed when I was in classes is that different lecturers, different teachers teach differently.
Yes.
And it's really important to watch how the lecturer lectures. Can you give us some hints on how to read the lecturer?
Well, yes, and I think that's an appropriate word to use there, reading the lecturer, because as we talk, we give cues to students, and hopefully they are clear, most of them. But they're not always direct. And so I want to talk about a couple of ways, a couple of hints for picking up on things. First of all, though, I wanted to go back and kind of mention types of lectures and make some distinctions here that I think are helpful for students, and a couple of warnings. First of all, you're going to encounter lectures in which there are no visual aids used, where there's simply someone standing in the front of the room talking. And in some respects, that's the hardest kind to deal with. In some respects, it's the easiest. Your attention is entirely focused on that speaker, for one thing. You're not trying to deal with anything else. You're just taking down what's being said. On the other hand, you don't have anything visual to help you. There's a difference, too, in that respect between a small class and a large class. And I know that here at the high school, most of our classes are small enough that even when there's a lecture going on, there's some interaction. And possibly I know that when I lecture, and in some of the clips that we're going to see here, you may hear some responses from students, or that I've requested some things, because even as I'm lecturing, I'll ask students for some input, particularly as we're doing background on a time period. They've studied world history, so I'll ask for some input as we're setting up a literature unit. And you have to remember in that kind of situation that what's going on is a combination of what the teacher is saying plus the input from the students. Now, most of the time, an instructor, of course, will rephrase, will repeat, will re-emphasize what the student said to put it together, but you have to pay attention to both of those things, that kind of interaction. On the other hand, in a very large class, like a lot of people will encounter, our seniors will encounter next year at college, it may be a lecture class of 200 or 250 students. There's not going to be a lot of interaction as the lecture proceeds, but you're simply expected to listen and take notes the entire time. Sometimes that lecture will proceed so quickly that you won't have time to think about things or to make a lot of judgments. I think I told you this the other day when we were talking, that I have lecture notes from one class in graduate school that have the jokes that the instructor told in my notes, because it was a question of I couldn't process. I was just writing down, and it was important to get everything, so there was no distinction made. And of course you go back and cull through that when you're studying. But you do have to sometimes just depend on what's given verbally. On the other hand, sometimes, and most of the time here at the high school, the chalkboard is used, and you'll see key terms put up there. The overhead is often used. I warn my students about what happens with the overhead, because sometimes there's so much material on the overhead, and we're using, and I think that we're guilty of this as teachers sometimes, that we're concentrating on getting through all this information and putting up sheet after sheet on this overhead. And students are so furiously trying to copy everything on the overhead, which is important, that they don't have time or forget to listen to the explanation and really the lecture that's keyed to what is basically a modified outline. Sometimes even a formal outline if somebody's really conscientious in using the overhead. But whether that's on the chalkboard or the overhead, either one, it's important that a student remembers to listen and ask questions in that situation. Ask for clarification as you go along. Directing them, or shifting them to what you're referring to as reading the lecture more, the first thing I'd want to talk about would be verbal cues that the lecturer actually gives. And the first one would be something that I'd simply label as a direct kind of cue. The lecturer may say something as explicit as "take this down," that's pretty obvious, or "this is important," or "make sure you remember." That's not saying take notes on this, but it's pretty obvious that that's what that means. You made a point the other day when we were talking that students sometimes make the mistake of writing down lots of information that they already know. And that would be an example there of if the teacher says, make sure you remember, if it is something that you're very comfortable with, a concept that you've studied in another class, or that you know this, then you don't need to take everything down. I would still suggest some sort of reference in the notes to make sure that you know that was part of it, but you don't need to get it all down. I think we have a clip here that I think speaks to this, don't we?
Yes.
And this would be some general comment. This is a lecture that I did recently that Mr. McDonald taped when I was talking about the Renaissance time period leading up to Shakespeare and our discussion of Macbeth, which we're doing right now in my English 4 class. And I'd gone through some general comments on Shakespeare, and it was kind of trivial stuff about his life, and it was clear that I was not expecting them to take all of this down. But then at one point in the tape, you'll hear, I will say something to the effect of, "Follow with me here." I've just mentioned a date of 1592 and said, now follow with me here again. Now that's not take notes, but that's exactly what I mean. Pick up again, this is important, you need to be getting this down. So we'll hear that in the tape.
Okay, let's watch the tape. Okay, now we can go on. We're back.
Okay. Another kind of verbal cue that an instructor might give is something that I'd simply refer to as indirect. And this is, and I think students are used to dealing with this, and unless they're really asleep, they're going to pick up on this without any problem either. And that's simply the repeating of a term or rephrasing. Obviously, if a teacher stands in the front of the room and says something more slowly or repeats it, or a student has said it and the teacher consciously rephrases it and repeats it, then that's important. And for example, I know in the lecture that we were just using part of here a moment ago, I repeated the golden age of drama as we were talking about the reign of Elizabeth I. I did not write that term on the board. I was using the board at the time, and we'll see a modified outline that I did here in just a moment. But I clearly emphasized golden age of drama in repeating it. So they need the terminology, and I think that was pretty clear. Also, instructors will use oftentimes, and this particularly is on the board, and oftentimes it's generated as you go through a lecture, a kind of abbreviated outline, which is very similar to the modified outline that you'll be taking in your notes. But what happens is that on the board there may be only the big general categories, the main topics, and then the lecturer will go through and fill in information under each segment. So, and that's usually left on the board the whole time so that as the shift is made you can write down the new category. But you need to make sure in getting information that you fit it into the right spots. And I think we see here, we have a clip that shows a modified outline that I've drawn on the board, and it sets up a kind of framework. What it does is to show the 3 time periods for the Renaissance: the rise, the height, and the decline of the Renaissance. And obviously terminology and simply notes would have to be fit in under those categories. You'll fit random words into that, and if you'll notice, I think we see another clip now from the lecture. Notice that the terms are piling up on the board at this point, almost randomly. You'll see the term Protestant Reformation next to the outline there on the board. You'll see the term Anglican, talking about the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Now, all it says up there is Protestant Reformation and Anglican. The student's task not only is to fit that into the proper category, but to understand what those terms mean. And that's the danger sometimes with the chalkboard, again, is simply taking down a term and not fully understanding, not taking enough notes that would go with that.
But anything that's written on the board needs to be in the student's notes.
I would say yes.
If a teacher has taken the time
Yes.
to write it, be it on an overhead, on the board, any place, that right there is a signal that it needs to be in the notes somewhere
Yes.
with an explanation.
Yes, and in fact that leads to the last 2 clips that I wanted to use here, which is an extension of what we were talking about with the outline and the terms randomly drawn on the board. As you remember from the outline that I had there on the board for you, it got pretty random by the time we were through with the discussion, and I was kind of free-forming it all over the board, and it's the student's responsibility. I could have perhaps been a little more organized, but I've made it clear verbally where those terms go. And what happens when a teacher gives single terms or dates or diagrams on the board, yes, those need to be in the notes, and the explanation. I want to emphasize that again. If we could go to the clip now that shows the board simply with the date 1649. And what I've drawn there, or I've written the date 1649, and I've circled that and put a star by it. And if you circle it and put a star by it in your notes with no explanation, it doesn't mean much.
Right.
So it's essential that you make the note of emphasis, but also the explanation for what that date, what happened in that date, why it was important. In addition to that, we'll see now if we can shift and see a clip with a picture showing the Great Chain of Being. Now this goes back kind of to the free-form diagrams or outlining, where I have a diagram on the board. And this one has a lot of things drawn out from it because it was generated by the class as we went through the discussion. Now this one probably is an example of note-taking in itself, because there's an expansion of the basic diagram, which is a hierarchy from God to rocks at the bottom as we were going through the Great Chain of Being. And probably what's on there is clear enough. And if you grasp the concept in class discussion and were clear enough with that the first time, maybe that's all the note you need. But if anything struck you as new or different or difficult about the concept, you would need some additional notes to go with the diagram. And I know that in looking back at students' notes sometimes, I'll see things that, yes, they've copied word for word off the board, and they have no earthly idea what they meant. And it really is the responsibility for the student to understand in addition to writing down.
One of the things that is a suggestion for students about taking notes is to leave a lot of space, to use maybe even a half-page technique, so that you're writing only on one side of your paper and leaving one side of your paper to go back and to clarify and to make additional notes, so that those notes are truly understandable.
That's a good idea, and lots of times the teacher will reinforce and kind of review to start a class period, kind of reviewing what was done in terms of notes the day before, or maybe summarize part of the literature that you're studying leading up to the section that you're discussing that day. And that would be a good time to go back and expand upon the notes that you had and make sure that they were clear. That kind of leads into the last part.
So we now have our notes taken.
Okay.
Now, what do we do?
You don't leave them. You don't leave them. You don't lose them. And you don't leave them sitting there until the night before the test. Teachers say it all the time, and I think students know that this is a good idea. And I know that I didn't do it all the time, but I know that I felt most comfortable in a course and most prepared for an exam when I'd studied on an ongoing basis. It's essential, particularly in a class where you're getting lots of new material that was difficult for you to grasp as you were writing it down, as you were taking notes. It's essential, I think, to review your notes on a daily basis. That reinforces the lecture of that day. It reinforces what you've written down and helps you to absorb it. And I really think that's the best time to do it in terms of a study skill, because it's freshest in your mind. And maybe there are some things that were kind of floating around up there, and if you go back through it, it'll kind of solidify, and you will kind of take ownership of that material. The other real important reason to go back through them then is to make sure that they make sense. Again, as you were taking notes quickly, there may have simply been something that you wrote down that you didn't understand in class, or you may have been taking notes so quickly that something you wrote down wouldn't make sense to anyone. In either case, you need some clarification, and it's easiest to get that if you go to the instructor the next day. You simply also have a hard time grasping it all and taking it all in if you leave it until the night before the test. So I think you really need that clarification and reinforcement. That comes back to what we said was one of the reasons for taking the notes in the first place. And here's the best place to get that reinforcement, is to do a kind of follow-up on your own.
Okay, so now we have found out why we need to take notes. We have some choices of how to take those notes and what to do with them once we've gotten them. I want to tell you thanks for being here. I know you have had to undergo quite a lot to get here. We brought the film crews into our room to get all of the film footage. I appreciate you so much, and congratulations for being Norman High's Teacher of the Year.
Thank you.
We're very proud of you.
Thank you very much.
And we will see you next week.